I was about to turn in for the night when I heard the knocking. Not the polite kind, not even the urgent kind. This was loud, relentless, and just shy of someone trying to break down my door. I froze for a second, phone in hand, debating whether to even open it. It was nearly midnight. Nobody I knew would show up at this hour without a good reason. The knocking didn't stop. If anything, it grew more desperate. I stepped toward the door, heart picking up speed, and checked the peephole. My 14-year-old nephew Daniel stood outside, shivering in the cold, a backpack slung over one shoulder. His hair was damp, his face pale under the porch light. I yanked the door open, the cold air rushing in. "Daniel?" His eyes darted past me, scanning the street behind him. "I ran away from home. Please, don't send me back." His voice was low, but there was something in the way he said it, an edge of fear. Not the bratty kind of "I ran away because I didn't get my way," but real fear. I stepped aside, letting him in without another word. He hesitated for half a second before slipping past me, gripping his backpack like his life depended on it. I locked the door behind him, flipping the deadbolt. The living room light cast a soft glow over him, making his exhaustion more obvious. His hoodie was damp, his jeans smeared with dirt. He didn't look hurt, but something was definitely wrong. I gestured toward the couch. "Sit, what happened?" He shook his head and stared at the floor. "Can I just stay here tonight?" "Of course, but Daniel, your parents." "No." He cut me off, voice sharp, then softer. "Don't call them, please." That set off alarm bells. My brother, his dad, wasn't the warmest guy, but he wasn't abusive. At least, I didn't think he was. My sister-in-law was strict, but nothing extreme. So why would Daniel show up like this? I sat across from him, watching as he rubbed his hands together, the tips of his fingers red from the cold. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head. "Did someone hurt you?" A pause. Then, "It's not safe there anymore." That sent a chill up my spine. I reached for my phone. "I just need to." "Don't." He shot up from the couch, eyes wide. "Please, don't call them." I hesitated, thumb hovering over my brother's contact. "Daniel, I can't just." I tried calling them earlier, but their phones just kept ringing. "Something's wrong." I dialed anyway. It rang. No answer. I tried my sister-in-law, straight to voicemail. Daniel let out a slow, shaky breath, as if he already knew. I leaned back, watching him. "You want to tell me what's going on?" Another head shake. "All right." He wasn't ready to talk, and pushing him wouldn't help. I switched gears. "Have you eaten?" He shook his head again. I went to the kitchen, heated up some leftovers, and placed the plate in front of him. He hesitated before digging in, eating like he hadn't had a proper meal in days. I let him eat in silence. As he ate, I noticed his backpack. It was half unzipped, the contents slightly visible. Clothes, a flashlight, and something else. A thick stack of cash, wrapped in a rubber band. My stomach tightened. I didn't say anything, not yet. I just watched him, noticed how he kept glancing at the windows, flinching slightly whenever a car passed outside. His leg bounced, restless. Finally, I said, "Where did you get the money?" He froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. Then he set it down. "It's mine." That's a lot of cash for a kid to have. He didn't respond. Before I could press further, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I frowned but ignored it. Probably spam. Daniel stiffened. His fingers gripped the edge of the table. "If you get a call from a blocked or unknown number, ignore it. That's how they track people." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Daniel, what exactly are you running from?" He swallowed hard. "They found me." I didn't understand what he meant until I heard it. The softest sound outside. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone walking along the sidewalk. I stood, moving to the window, careful not to shift the blinds too much. A man stood beneath the streetlight, just outside my house. His face was obscured by the angle, but he wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. A sharp inhale from behind me. I turned to Daniel. His face was pale, eyes locked on the figure outside. "Is that?" "I don't know," he whispered. I looked again, but the man was gone. The street empty, the night silent. Daniel wrapped his arms around himself, shrinking into the chair. "They know I'm here." A sick feeling twisted in my gut. I had no idea what I had just been pulled into. I woke up to the sound of quiet movement in the kitchen. The house was still dim, the early morning light barely seeping through the curtains. I got up, moving cautiously toward the kitchen, half expecting to see Daniel still asleep on the couch. Instead, he was already awake, sitting at the table, staring at an untouched piece of toast. His fingers drummed lightly against the wood, his eyes flicking up when he noticed me. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. I checked my phone immediately. Still no calls or texts from my brother or sister-in-law. It wasn't normal. Even if they were angry or worried, they would have called by now. Something was off. Daniel was watching me closely, like he was waiting for me to say something. I took the seat across from him and dialed again. My brother's number, straight to voicemail. My sister-in-law, same thing. I tried a third time, this time listening for any sounds of relief or worry from Daniel. Nothing. He just sat there silent. I set my phone down and leaned forward. Still no word from your parents. Daniel nodded but didn't say anything. I waited, but when it was clear he wasn't going to speak up on his own, I asked, "Are you ready to tell me what's going on?" He hesitated, fingers curling into his hoodie sleeves. Something changed at home. That was all he gave me. No details. No explanations. I glanced at his backpack, remembering the thick stack of cash. The money, where did you get it? His jaw tightened. I had to take it. I studied him for a second, waiting to see if he would say more, but he didn't. The way he said it, the way he held himself, told me there was more to it. He wasn't just a kid who grabbed some cash and bolted for fun. He wasn't acting rebellious or smug. He was scared. I exhaled and stood up. "We're going to your house." Daniel's head snapped up. "No, I need to check on your parents. If you're not telling me the whole story, I need to see for myself." He clenched his hands, but he didn't argue. The drive over was quiet. Daniel stared out the window, his knee bouncing. I pulled up to their house, immediately noticing something was off. Both of their cars were in the driveway, but the house looked wrong. Curtains were drawn, but I could see through a small gap. The living room was a mess. The coffee table knocked over, papers and books scattered across the floor. It didn't look like a normal mess. It looked like someone had searched the place in a hurry. I knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Silence. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked. I called their names, listening for any movement inside. Nothing. I stepped back, my gut twisting. Daniel was gripping the door of my car, watching me with wide eyes. That was it. I wasn't going to wait around. I pulled out my phone and called the police for a welfare check. When I told Daniel, he went rigid. "You just made it worse," he muttered, voice shaking. His fingers dug into the fabric of his hoodie. "They'll know." "Who?" I asked, but he wouldn't answer. Minutes passed. The air felt thick with something I couldn't name. Then a black SUV rolled slowly down the street. I wouldn't have paid much attention to it if it hadn't slowed down right in front of the house. The windows were tinted, but I could see the outline of a man in the driver's seat. Sunglasses. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking at me. Then, as if satisfied, he drove off. I turned to Daniel, but his eyes were locked on the SUV as it disappeared down the road. The police arrived 10 minutes later. 2 officers stepped out, glancing at me before moving toward the house. I explained the situation, keeping it simple. "My nephew showed up at my place last night. His parents won't answer, and the house looks like someone's been through it." The officers exchanged a look before one of them knocked. When there was no answer, they stepped around the side, peering into windows. A few minutes later, one of them radioed for backup. That's when I knew this wasn't just some misunderstanding. One of the officers came back to me, his expression unreadable. "We need to enter the house." They got the door open within minutes. Inside, the place was a wreck. Furniture overturned, drawers open, clothes strewn across the floor. It wasn't just a mess. It looked like someone had been searching for something. But the worst part, no one was inside. The officers checked every room, their voices low as they communicated through their radios. When they came back, their expressions were grim. "This isn't good," one muttered to the other. I was about to ask what they meant when another officer came out of the kitchen, holding something in his gloved hand. 2 phones. My brother's and sister-in-law's, left behind on the counter. Something was seriously wrong. Then another officer called us over to the fridge. There was a note, written in hurried, slanted handwriting. "Tell Daniel to run." They found us. Everything felt like it stopped for a second. I turned to Daniel, but he was already backing away, his breath coming in short, fast bursts. One of the officers started speaking into his radio again, calling for more units. I took a slow step toward Daniel, keeping my voice calm. "Daniel, what is this?" His hands were shaking. "We have to go." I didn't understand what was happening. But one thing was clear. Daniel was the key to whatever this was. And now we were both in the middle of it. Daniel's breathing turned erratic the second the officer read the note aloud. His hands trembled as he gripped the sleeves of his hoodie, shoulders rising and falling too fast. His lips moved, barely above a whisper. I told you they were coming." One of the officers noticed and moved toward him, lowering his voice. "Hey kid, breathe, you're safe right now." Daniel flinched, backing up until his back hit the wall. His chest rose sharply, gasping like he couldn't pull in enough air. He was panicking. I moved closer, keeping my voice steady. "Daniel, focus on me. Breathe in slow." His eyes darted around the room, unfocused. His breath hitched, his fingers clenching around the fabric of his hoodie. It took another minute before his breathing evened out, but the tension in his body never left. The officers had more questions after that. They pulled me aside, asking about the situation. When Daniel arrived at my house, what he had told me, anything that might explain why his parents were missing. I didn't have much to give them. "He won't say what happened," I admitted. "Just that he had to leave. He won't even tell me why." One of the officers glanced at Daniel, If his parents were in trouble, he might know more than he's letting on. I already knew that. What I didn't know was whether he was staying silent out of fear, or if there was something bigger going on. Then, I noticed something. Daniel's hand was inside his hoodie pocket, gripping something tightly. He saw me looking and stiffened. When the officers turned away, I pulled him aside. "What's in your pocket?" He hesitated, then slowly pulled out a cheap plastic phone. It wasn't his usual one. A burner phone. I took it from him, checking the screen. Only one recent message. No contact name, no number. Just a message. "Too late. They know." My stomach tightened. "Who sent this?" Daniel didn't answer. His silence said enough. Before I could press further, a car pulled up outside. A dark sedan. A man stepped out, mid-40s, wearing a dark jacket. He walked straight toward the officers with a confident stride. One of the officers waved me over. "This man claims he's a private investigator, but he won't show any ID. And when I ask how my brother hired him, he changes the subject." I turned toward Daniel, but his entire body had gone stiff. His hands clenched. He didn't blink. The so-called investigator looked me over and smiled like he was trying to be reassuring. "You must be the uncle. Listen, I know this is a lot, but I was hired to find Daniel. His parents were worried about his safety. We need to get him somewhere secure." Daniel barely moved, but I heard the whisper under his breath. "That's not a real investigator. He's one of them." I stared at the man again. He didn't seem particularly dangerous, but something felt off. The officer frowned, stepping between us. "Do you have proof the parents hired you?" The man's smile didn't waver. "Unfortunately, no. My contact with them was brief, and I wasn't able to get paperwork before they went off the grid. But I assure you, I'm here to help." That was a weak excuse. No real investigator would show up without credentials. I didn't wait. "Daniel stays with me." The man exhaled, his expression unreadable. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand enough." He stared at me for a moment, then nodded slightly. "All right, just be careful. Some people don't want him to exist." The words made my skin crawl. The officers, not having any legal reason to intervene, let him go. The sedan disappeared down the street. I turned to Daniel. "We're leaving." He didn't argue. We packed essentials, grabbed his backpack, and got into my car. I drove for hours, stopping only when we were far enough from town to be untraceable. We checked into a rundown motel, cash payment, no names. By the time we got inside, Daniel was pale and exhausted. I checked outside before locking the door. That was when I saw it. The same black SUV from before, parked near the motel. We had been followed. I shut the curtains immediately. "Daniel, we need to talk. You have to tell me everything." He hesitated. Then finally, "It's not just me. They were after something my parents had. And now I think I have it." I stared at him, then at his backpack. I opened it, checking through his things, and then tucked into a hidden compartment. I found it. A small flash drive, labeled, "Do not open." The motel room was silent, except for the hum of my laptop as I plugged in the flash drive. I didn't expect much, maybe some family documents or financial records. But the second the files loaded, I knew this was something else entirely. Most of the files were locked behind encryption, unreadable, without a password. But there was one accessible folder, labeled, "Evidence." I clicked it open. Inside was a single video file. Daniel hovered over my shoulder as I clicked play. The screen flickered, and then there they were, his parents. His father sat in a dimly lit room, his face pale and tight with fear. His mother was behind him, pacing. His father leaned in toward the camera and whispered, "If you're seeing this, they got to us. Do not trust anyone. Keep running." Then the screen went black. Daniel let out a sharp breath, gripping the edge of the table. His whole body trembled, but he didn't cry, just stood there completely still, as if frozen. I scrolled through the files again, looking for anything else that might give us a clue. There was one unencrypted document. I opened it. A list of names, account numbers, large transactions moving through offshore accounts. One name stood out immediately. Alan Whitmore. I knew that name. He was my brother's business partner, a wealthy investor I had met at a few family gatherings. He had always seemed polished, professional, but his name was attached to transactions worth millions, moving through multiple countries. Before I could say anything, a knock echoed through the motel room. Not a casual knock, hard, demanding. I froze. Daniel's breath hitched. I moved slowly to the window, lifting the curtain just enough to see outside. The man from before,
A so-called private investigator, standing at the door.
The knocking turned into pounding. I shut the laptop and grabbed Daniel's arm, keeping my voice low. "We need to go. Now." He didn't ask questions, just grabbed his backpack and followed me to the back door. The second we stepped into the alley behind the motel, I heard the door handle rattle. They were trying to get in. We ran. We reached the car just as the black SUV from before sped into the lot, headlights flashing in our direction. I threw the car into reverse, barely clearing the parking lot before the SUV turned to follow. They were on us within seconds. Daniel was gripping the seat, glancing back every few seconds. I swerved onto a main road, dodging late-night traffic. The SUV stuck close, but they weren't trying to ram us, just keeping up, waiting. I wasn't going to give them the chance. A few blocks down, I spotted a shopping plaza with multiple exits. I pulled in fast, weaving through the rows of parked cars, before coming to a stop behind a delivery truck. Out, I said, grabbing the bag from the back seat. Daniel didn't hesitate. We left the car behind, moving quickly through the plaza. I spotted a rental kiosk, the kind that took cash. Perfect. Minutes later, we had a new car. Daniel pulled out his burner phone, staring at it for a second before walking over to a trash can and dropping it inside. I drove without saying a word for a long time. We were heading nowhere, just far. Then I pulled out my own phone and made a call. Mark picked up on the second ring. "You never call this late. I need your help." There was a pause. "This about the flash drive?" I wasn't even surprised he knew. "Yeah." His voice dropped. "If this is what I think it is, people kill over this. Don't connect it to the internet." I exhaled. "Can you crack it?" "Maybe, but not over the phone. You need to get to me." Carefully, I agreed and hung up. Daniel was staring out the window. He spoke without turning his head. "My dad knew this would happen." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "He was planning to disappear." That changed everything. If my brother knew things would go bad, that meant he had a backup plan. Then Daniel muttered. He had a second phone, always kept it locked in his office desk. I gripped the steering wheel. "Do you think it's still there?" He shrugged. If they didn't take it, it was a huge risk. Going back to the house meant walking straight into danger. But if that phone had answers, it was our best shot at figuring out what the hell was going on. I glanced at Daniel. "Are you sure about this?" He nodded. "It's our only chance." I made a sharp turn, heading back toward the city, straight into whatever waited for us. Daniel and I waited until well past midnight before making our move. The streets were quiet, most houses dark. We parked 2 blocks away, staying in the shadows as we approached his house. I found the spare key exactly where my brother always kept it, taped under a loose brick in the garage. The moment I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I knew we had made a mistake. The place had been torn apart, more than before. Drawers yanked out, their contents scattered across the floor. Couch cushions slashed open. Even the kitchen cabinets were left wide open, as if someone had been looking for something specific. Daniel gripped my sleeve. His voice was barely above a whisper. "They came back." We didn't have time to dwell on it. I headed straight for my brother's office. If the phone was still there, it would be in his desk. The office was just as wrecked. The computer was missing. Papers littered the floor. Filing cabinets had been tipped over. But the desk was still intact. I pulled open the drawers. Empty. I remembered something. Years ago, my brother had told me he installed a false bottom in his desk drawer for important documents. If whoever ransacked the place didn't know that, they wouldn't have found it. I ran my fingers along the inside of the drawer, tapping lightly until I heard the hollow sound. There. I pried it open. A burner phone sat in the hidden compartment, untouched. I grabbed it, shoving it into my pocket. Before I could say anything to Daniel, he inhaled sharply and whispered, "Someone's here." I froze. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. Daniel pressed himself against the desk, his breath shallow. The steps grew louder, moving toward the staircase. Someone was coming down. I peeked through the gap in the office door just in time to see a figure step into the hallway. A man, dressed in a dark suit and gloves, moving with calculated purpose. He wasn't looking around. He already knew what he was searching for. Daniel's grip tightened on my sleeve. The man turned toward the office. I didn't think. I grabbed Daniel and bolted for the back door. The moment our feet hit the porch, I heard the man shout something into a radio. A second later, the sound of an engine revving up the street sent ice down my spine. The black SUV. It had been waiting. I yanked open the car door, barely giving Daniel time to jump in before peeling out of the driveway. The SUV's headlights flared behind us, closing in fast. They weren't just following us, they were hunting us. The streets were empty, but I had no chance of outrunning them in a straight line. They had the faster car. I spotted an alley up ahead. Without thinking, I cut the wheel hard, tires screeching as I veered in. Darkness swallowed us. I killed the headlights and rolled to a stop behind a dumpster. Daniel clutched the door handle, staring straight ahead. We listened. The SUV slowed at the alley entrance. I held my breath. The engine idled. I could see their silhouette through the windshield. Whoever was driving was scanning the area. I gripped the wheel tighter. If they turned in, we were trapped. Then, after a painfully long pause, the SUV rolled forward. It drove away. Neither of us moved for a full minute. Then Daniel whispered, "They're not going to stop." He was right. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the burner phone. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. Only one unsent message sat in the draft folder. Redwood, 8 a.m. Come alone. I showed it to Daniel. He stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. What's Redwood? I had no idea, but my brother had planned to meet someone there, and if we wanted answers, that was our next destination. Mark worked fast. I sent him a secure copy of the flash drive, and within hours, he called me back. His voice was tense, the usual calm edge gone. This isn't just corporate fraud. This is government-level corruption. I parked in an empty lot just outside the city, Daniel next to me, staring at the phone. I put Mark on speaker. The files show money being funneled through offshore accounts, but it's not just corporate embezzlement. It's connected to high-level government contracts, defense spending, infrastructure deals, even some classified projects. Your brother's firm? It was being used as a front. Daniel exhaled sharply. His father had been running a business, not a criminal empire, but now, it made sense why they had been targeted. He had uncovered something he wasn't supposed to. Then Mark said, and I figured out what Redwood means. Daniel's eyes snapped to the phone. It's an old warehouse, shut down years ago, about an hour outside the city. From what I can tell, it used to be a meeting spot for off-the-record business deals. Silence filled the car. Daniel spoke first. If my dad is alive, he'll be there. We didn't have much time. Redwood was our only lead, and if his father had arranged a meeting, he must have had a backup plan. I looked at Daniel. This could be a trap. He clenched his jaw. We have to go. An hour later we pulled up to Redwood. The place was abandoned. A massive warehouse, rusting at the edges, with faded company logos barely visible on the side. The front doors hung open, the wind creaking them back and forth. No lights, no movement, just silence. I parked a short distance away, scanning the area before getting out. Inside, the air was thick with dust. Broken pallets and rusted metal scraps littered the floor. Footsteps echoed as we moved deeper, the sound bouncing off the empty walls. Then Daniel spotted it. A chair, old and splintered, shoved against the far wall. Taped underneath was an envelope. I pulled it free, recognizing my brother's handwriting before I even opened it. The letter was short. If you found this, I couldn't make it. They got to us faster than I expected. Protect Daniel. Do not trust anyone. That was all. Daniel stared at the words, his fists clenched. I was about to say something when a sound cut through the silence. Engines, multiple. I turned toward the entrance as headlights flooded the warehouse. Vehicles surrounded the building, SUV doors slammed. Then a figure stepped forward. Alan Whitmore. He adjusted his suit jacket like this was just another business meeting. Two men flanked him, their expressions unreadable. Whitmore's smile was cold. You've made this more complicated than it needed to be. Daniel stepped forward before I could stop him. Where are my parents? Whitmore tilted his head slightly. You don't want to waste time on that question. Daniel's fists shook. You took them. Whitmore sighed. This isn't personal, Daniel. It's just business. Your father made the mistake of getting involved in something bigger than him. And now, here you are. Then, he turned his gaze to me. Hand over the flash drive, and this all goes away. I didn't move. Daniel didn't either. One of the men stepped forward, pulling a gun. This is not a negotiation. The air felt razor thin. Then another car screeched onto the scene. Mark. He stepped out, holding a laptop under one arm. Too late, he called out. I already sent everything to the press. Whitmore's expression didn't change at first. Then his phone buzzed. I saw the moment it hit him. His face darkened. Then everything erupted. Gunfire cracked through the air. Mark dove behind his car. I grabbed Daniel and ran. We bolted for the side exit. More shots rang out, bullets tearing into metal. The SUV scrambled as men shouted orders. I threw open the car door, barely waiting for Daniel to get inside before flooring it. As we sped away, my phone buzzed. News alerts. Breaking, government corruption exposed in billion-dollar laundering scheme. Headlines were everywhere. The fallout had begun. I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating non-stop. The cheap motel room was still dark, the old curtains barely blocking the early morning light. Daniel was curled up on the other bed, breathing slow and steady. He had barely gotten any sleep the last few days, but last night, exhaustion finally caught up to him. I checked my phone. News alerts flooded the screen. Breaking, massive government corruption scandal exposed top officials, named in billion-dollar money laundering investigation. Alan Whitmore arrested in connection to fraud, conspiracy and embezzlement. The leak had worked. I called Mark. He picked up immediately. It's bigger than we thought, he said. Journalists are pulling at every thread. There are politicians, high-ranking executives, even law enforcement officials tied to this. Whitmore was just the middleman. I glanced over at Daniel, still asleep, and Whitmore, feds picked him up last night. He's facing multiple charges, but he's not the top guy. Someone else was running this operation, and they're still out there. That last part made my stomach turn. I got up and checked outside through the blinds. The street was quiet, but then, a familiar sight made me tense. The black SUV. It was parked a few buildings down, engine running. Even with Whitmore arrested, someone was still watching us. I stepped away from the window and locked the door. That night, something woke me up. A sound, soft, deliberate, scratching, near the door. I grabbed a lamp, the closest thing I had to a weapon, and moved toward it silently. The scratching stopped. Then, footsteps retreating. I yanked the door open, but the hallway was empty. Whoever had been there was gone. Minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Mark. He had forwarded me an email. Subject: "You are not safe. Leave the city. Now." No sender information. No signature. I stared at the screen, knowing exactly what it meant. Whitmore's arrest hadn't ended this. Then, another news alert popped up. One of Whitmore's associates arrested. Slips up during questioning. Mentions a phrase. They might still be useful. Daniel's parents. There was a chance they were still alive. I woke Daniel up, showing him the news. He sat up fast, gripping the phone like he thought it might disappear. "They're alive," he whispered. I nodded. "But we have to find them before these people do." Mark had already started working on it. By morning he sent me a message. Whitmore had a safe house. Out of state. It's our best lead. But getting there wouldn't be easy. If someone had tried to break into our motel room, that meant we were being tracked. We couldn't just leave. We had to disappear. We dumped everything. Phones, credit cards, even the rental car. Mark helped us create fake travel records, making it seem like we had flown overseas. We weren't just running. We were making sure no one could follow. With new burner phones and cash-only purchases, we rented an old truck and started driving toward the safe house. It was deep in the countryside, miles away from any main roads, the kind of place no one would look unless they already knew it was there. By the time we arrived, the sun was starting to set. The house was small, run down, windows boarded up, no signs of life. Daniel stayed behind while I stepped out first. The place was too quiet. I moved toward the front door, keeping my footsteps light. Then, movement. A man in a suit stepped out from behind the house, gun raised. "Stop right there." I froze. Daniel saw him and went rigid. The man didn't move closer. He was waiting, assessing. Then, from inside the house, a weak voice. "Daniel, his mother, she was alive." Daniel didn't hesitate. The second he heard his mother's voice, he ran toward the house. I barely had time to react before he was already at the door. The gunman didn't fire. Instead, he hesitated, lowering the barrel slightly as Daniel rushed past him. His stance shifted, tense, but not aggressive. Daniel disappeared inside, and I took the chance to step forward, keeping my hands visible. The man kept his grip firm on the gun, but didn't raise it again. Inside, Daniel was already at his mother's side. She looked weak, her face pale, her clothes loose, like she had lost too much weight in too little time. A deep cut ran along her forehead, half-healed but still dark with bruising. She held on to Daniel with shaky hands. "They took your father," she whispered. The gunman stepped inside and shut the door behind us. "My name is James," he said. "I worked with your father." Daniel looked up sharply. His mother closed her eyes for a brief second, then nodded. "He's telling the truth." I glanced at James, then start talking. James exhaled and holstered the gun. "Your brother wasn't just uncovering fraud. He found something much worse. Proof of who was really pulling the strings. Whitmore was just the face. The real power is behind him." Daniel's mother gripped his hand tighter. "Before they took him, he told me something, that he hid one last piece of evidence." James nodded. "The second flash drive. It has the final records, proof of every transaction, every connection. If we find it, we can bring them all down." Daniel's mother looked at him. "He said it was somewhere only you would find." Daniel frowned, thinking. Dad told me once if anything ever went wrong, I should check the floorboards at the cabin. I never understood what he meant. Until now. "The cabin." I glanced at him. "What cabin?" "Our old vacation cabin," he said. "We barely used it, but when I was little, I used to hide things under the floorboards in my room. My dad was the only one who knew." James didn't hesitate. "Then we need to go. Now." We loaded into the truck, keeping Daniel's mother in the back seat, wrapped in a blanket. James took the passenger seat, scanning the roads as I drove. Halfway there, I noticed it. A car, far behind us but keeping pace, not passing, not falling back. James glanced in the side mirror. "Stay calm. Drive normal." I kept my foot steady on the gas. The car didn't make a move. Then, as we neared the turnoff toward the cabin, it sped up. Gunfire. Glass shattered as a bullet tore through the back window. I yanked the wheel hard, swerving off the road just as the car barreled closer. Tires kicked up dust as I cut through the trees, branches scraping against the sides of the truck. James pulled out his gun and fired back. The pursuing car jerked but kept coming. Up ahead, the cabin came into view. "Get them inside," James shouted, still firing. I slammed on the brakes. Daniel grabbed his mother, helping her out as I ran behind them. More shots cracked through the trees. James ducked behind the truck, returning fire. Inside, Daniel ran straight to the corner of the room. He dropped to his knees and pried at the floorboards. Come on," he muttered. His fingers dug under the wood, yanking it up. A sealed envelope sat inside the hollow space. He pulled it out just as the door flew open. A man in a black suit lunged inside, gun raised. I reacted before I could think. I grabbed his wrist and shoved it aside, just as the gun went off, the shot burying into the ceiling. We struggled, feet kicking over furniture as he tried to break free. Daniel clutched the envelope, frozen in place. Then another gunshot, outside. The attacker's grip weakened. His body jolted before crumbling forward. James stepped into the doorway, gun still raised. Outside, the woods had gone quiet. The last of the attackers were down. James lowered his weapon. I stood, breathing hard, and turned to Daniel. He was still gripping the envelope. Inside was the second flash drive, the final piece. James locked the door behind us, scanning the cabin. "This is it," he said. "With this we can bring them all down." Daniel held the drive close. His mother was watching him, her expression unreadable. Then he looked at me. "If we leak this," he said slowly, "do we lose any chance of finding my dad?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. James paced the length of the cabin, his hands on his hips. The second flash drive sat on the table between us. Daniel's mother was still weak, resting in the corner, while Daniel sat close by, his hands clenched together. "We leak this, we expose everything," James said, stopping in front of me. "But we also lose any leverage to get your brother back." Daniel looked at me. "We can't just leave him." I knew that. I had already made my decision. Mark called minutes later. "I found something," he said. "A weak link. Senator David Cormack. He's up to his neck in this. Offshore accounts. Dummy corporations. His name is everywhere." I pulled the burner phone away from my ear and put it on speaker. "If we push him," Mark continued, "he might crack. If anyone knows where your brother is, it's him." We didn't have much time. I sent an encrypted message to a private government email, one of Cormac's personal contacts. "Pulled from the files. We have the evidence. We know everything. Give us Daniel's father, or we bring the whole system down." Minutes passed. Then a response. "Who are you? What do you want?" I sent a single sentence back. "The location. Now." The next response came almost instantly. "An address." James took one look at it and swore under his breath. "That's a private compound. Heavily guarded." I didn't care. Then we go in prepared. We left before dawn. The drive was tense, silent. James had a bag of weapons in the back, courtesy of old contacts. Daniel's mother insisted on coming, despite her condition. She refused to leave without her husband. When we arrived, we kept our distance, watching from a hill overlooking the compound. Floodlights swept over the property, illuminating high fences and armed men patrolling the perimeter. No easy way in. James checked his watch. "We go in fast. No hesitation." We moved through the trees, keeping low. Mark had hacked into the compound's cameras, giving us a rough idea of where to go. Then we made our move. James took out the first guard, before he could sound an alarm. I followed close behind, keeping Daniel and his mother hidden as we slipped through a side entrance. Inside, the place was all concrete and steel. A private prison disguised as a residence. Gunfire erupted behind us. Guards spotted James and Mark. Bullets ricocheted off walls as they returned fire, clearing a path. We ran, down a hallway, through a heavy door, until we reached a locked room. James fired a single round into the lock, and the door burst open. Daniel's father sat inside, bruised and weak, but alive. Daniel ran to him, wrapping his arms around him. Shaking, "Dad, we're getting you out," he said, his voice steady despite everything. His father gripped his shoulder. "You found it?" Daniel nodded. We turned to leave. A figure stepped into the hallway, one of Whitmore's remaining associates, a tall man in a gray suit, gun in hand. "You walk away," he said, voice calm, "and we let you live." James didn't hesitate. One shot, the man collapsed. "Let's go," James ordered. We ran. Outside, the alarms were blaring. More men were coming. We barely made it to the car before reinforcements arrived. James floored the gas pedal, speeding down the dirt road, kicking up dust behind us. No one followed. By the time we reached a safe house, it was over. Daniel's father was weak but stable. Daniel sat next to him the whole time, never letting go of his hand. The second flash drive contained the last of the evidence we needed. We leaked everything. Within days, the entire operation crumbled. High-ranking officials were arrested. CEOs exposed. The corruption ran deeper than we had imagined, but with both flash drives in the public eye, no one could cover it up anymore. Whitmore's empire was gone. Daniel's family had no choice but to disappear. Too many enemies, too many people who wanted revenge. James pulled in every favor he had. Within a week, we had a way out, using real passports marked as lost in the system. The night before they left, Daniel handed me a note. "You saved my life. I will never forget you." I watched them board a plane early the next morning. Then, just like that, they were gone. I went back to my life, but nothing felt the same. Months passed. One evening, an envelope arrived at my door. No return address. Inside, a single note: "We never forget."